Hello, you guys. My name is Emma Reiner. I'm the family and community educator here. Thank you so much for joining us at our March Lunchbox lecture. Our Lunchbox lecture is a noontime history lecture series, which takes place on the third Tuesday of every month here in the Old Father Auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum in Lincoln. If you'd like to watch our previous lectures or check out our podcast, you can find us on YouTube at NE Historical. Before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors for this program, the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. Their support allows us to host these free monthly programs, as well as record and broadcast them across the state and online. Also, a special thank you to LNK TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, for producing these programs. And always thank you to our members. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to learn more and join. The support of our members enable us to offer free programs just like this one here in Lincoln and across the state. You can learn more about our museum, our programming, and all the services provided by the Nebraska State Historical Society online at history.nebraska.gov. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Dianne Bystrom. Dr. Bystrom was the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women and Politics at Iowa State University for 22 years before retiring in August of 2018. She currently serves on the Communications Committee for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska and contributes to a number of books and articles. As we commemorate Women's History Month today, Dr. Bystrom's presentation will explore the long and determined fight for women's voting rights in Nebraska. The 72-year campaign for women's suffrage in the United States culminated in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, ensuring voting rights could not be denied on the basis of sex. Her presentation will trace Nebraska's suffrage movement from its beginnings in 1856 through its setbacks and ultimate successes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bystrom.
Well, thanks a lot, Emma, and thank you for turning out in this cold weather. It's typical Nebraska weather. I drove on Sunday to Des Moines to get my global entry through a snowstorm, but those are hard to get, so I did it. Now it's cold, and it's going to be 70 or 80 later this week, so welcome back, I guess, to Nebraska. Iowa weather is kind of the same way. So, yes, what I'm going to talk about today, so a little bit about how I approach this. I retired from Iowa State University in 2018 in August after directing the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics for 22 years. And what you'll learn today, if you don't already know, but Carrie Chapman Catt devoted 33 years of her life to the women's suffrage movement, starting out when she was 28 years old into the 60s, to her 60s. And she also established the League of Women Voters. So when I went to Iowa State to direct the Carrie Chapman Catt Center, it's just the second center for women in politics in the country at a university. The first is Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers. So when I went there, two things. I was at the University of Oklahoma trying to get back to my hometown of Fremont, but also this tremendous opportunity to direct a Center for Women in Politics when my dissertation research had been on that, and I've always kind of been a political junkie. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for me and to learn more about Carrie Chapman Catt. So when I moved here in 2018 in August, a member of the Humanities Nebraska Board reached out to me, and of course we were going to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment in 2020. So they said, can you do a presentation on suffrage for Humanities Nebraska? And I said, oh yeah, of course I will. And I really studied contemporary women in politics, but I knew a lot about Carrie Chapman Catt. So I was booked at a lot of libraries in 2020. Started out in January at Douglas County Historical Society. Then things were canceled because of COVID. So the good side of that for me is that I took a really deep dive into the history of suffrage in Nebraska. And so that's what I'm going to be. So then I kind of redid my talk to make it more relatable, I think, to Nebraskans about their suffrage movement, because it's really a very long history. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the 72-year movement. And of course, you can't hit all the dots about that, but 72-year campaign in the United States, starting in 1848 and culminating in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But we have a 64-year history in Nebraska. We have a long history. And we could have been the first state, and actually the first territory and then the first state, to grant women's suffrage. We had 4 opportunities to do so before Wyoming became the first territory and the first state, and we did not succeed in those. So I'll be talking about that today. And then I'm going to do a quick kind of overview of how women have voted since 1920 going through the 2024 election, and then we are going to open it up to questions, and we should have about at least 15 minutes. So that's how we're going to progress today. So the movement began 1848. It came out of the abolitionist movement. And so a lot of these early women's suffrage leaders were in the abolitionist movement. That included Lucretia Mott, who's up there, and also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's seated in the chair. She's with Susan B. Anthony, but Susan B. was not in the abolitionist movement at the time. But anyway, Lucretia and Elizabeth Cady Stanton thought that there should be a women's rights convention. So they organized one to meet in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. It was a 2-day convention. The first day was only for women. And the second day, they opened it up to men, and including some of the men that came were Frederick Douglass, who was the abolitionist and also fighting for women's suffrage. They started out, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote something called the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, that all men and women were created equal. And so she patterned that after the Declaration of Independence. So they just kind of read through that the first day. Then on the second day, they had all these things that they wanted to vote on, how women could have equality in society, in the home, in religion, all sorts of things. The only thing that was really controversial was women's sacred right to the elective franchise. There were people there that thought that was just going too far. Like, they're never going to give us the right to vote. We can't ask for that. Let's ask for some of this other stuff. And so it was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass got up and said, we're not going to get this other stuff unless we have the right to vote. So that was passed as well. So then we went through about 20-some years of having the American Equal Rights Association conventions. And the American Equal Rights Association was known as a universal suffrage organization. That meant they were working for African American men, African American women, and white women to get the right to vote. So it was a universal suffrage association. So now we go to Nebraska. Amelia Bloomer, yes, she's the one that invented bloomers for women to wear as a form of pants. She lived in Council Bluffs, Nebraska. So she came over to Omaha and talked, and people thought she was a really good speaker, and we should have her speak to the territorial legislature. Here's our first chance to be the first territory in the country to grant women the right to vote. So she speaks in January 1856 to the territorial legislature. Back then, we had a lower house and an upper house in the legislature, and so the House passed a suffrage resolution. So then it went to the upper house, and they just didn't vote on it. It wasn't because there was a lot of controversy or people were against it. They just ran out of time. They were apparently really involved in setting boundaries for counties in the territory. So that was the first chance. But they did in 1867. We became the second state or territory in the United States that basically grant woman suffrage, for school suffrage, I mean. So that meant, so Kansas was first and we were second, and that the thought behind that is that women knew a lot about education. You know, they were moms, they had kids in schools, so they let them vote on things that had to do with schools that would include bond issues and also board elections. So back to the American suffrage movement, the U.S. one. They had a lot of fighting after the Civil War with what was becoming amendments to the Constitution. So the American Equal Rights Association, again, this universal suffrage organization that united black men, white women, black women into one association, split into two associations. And the associations were not by racial lines. There were black women who were in the ones that were against the amendments. There were white women who were ones that embraced the amendments. It was not split that way. But there were basically two amendments came out of it. So the 14th Amendment, which does a lot of stuff, you hear about it mostly today with the due process clauses in that amendment. But what it did is it introduced for the very first time the word male in the U.S. Constitution. So when it did that, and then the next amendment enfranchised black men, and the two of them together basically gave voting rights to African American men, but not African American women or white women. So big split. Two associations were formed, the National Woman Association. They were the ones that were against both of those amendments. And they included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, some of the leaders. Actually, there was Sojourner Truth, who was an African-American suffragist at the time. She was in that association. So again, not really dividing up by racial lines as much as strategy. So they were more seen as the militant organization. They were demanding a federal constitution amendment. So the other one was the American Women's Suffrage Association. They supported these two amendments, plus their whole strategy was to go state by state. So they would get suffrage that way. So that's how they split. Then back in Nebraska, so interestingly enough, so Nebraska has its second chance to have women's suffrage as a state. So the delegates gathered together in 1871 to write a constitution for a new state. And so they had various clauses in it, and one was women's suffrage. So then it went to a vote of the people, and again, who could vote then? Men. And so they voted, and suffrage got the least votes. Giving women the right to vote got 22% of the votes. And the whole Constitution was actually scrapped, so they didn't approve it. So they gathered again in 1875, if you go that way on the slide. So they went again in 1875, 4 years later. Well, they learned a lot. And one of the things they learned is people here don't want women voting. So they did a constitution that denied voting rights to criminals, the mentally ill, and women. So that was the constitution that was passed by Nebraska in 1875. But did the national suffrage leaders give up on Nebraska? No. They still thought we could be the first state to grant women's suffrage. So Susan B. Anthony actually came in 1877 to Hebron, to Beatrice, Grand Island, speaking there. As I was telling Emma a little bit before, and I've spoken in Hebron a few months ago, they really were kind of the hotbed of women's suffrage in the state of Nebraska during that time. Then you have in 1879, actually, Elizabeth Cady Stanton coming to Hebron and organizing the first county party, Thayer County Women's Suffrage Association. That grew by 1881 into 39 local and county suffrage associations across Nebraska. So again, very vibrant movement at the time. So back on the national level, for the very first time, the suffrage amendment, which again, it was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, because we didn't know what kind of number it was going to get. And so in 1878, they first proposed the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. You know, Emma talked a little bit about it, but it was the right of the citizens of the United States shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of sex. And so this is how it was written. It's important to note it was written on citizens, and you know, we can talk about it maybe in the Q&A, but not everybody today that is considered a citizen was considered a citizen back then. 15th Amendment granting African American men the right to vote is written the same way, is written on citizens. So the very first vote on women's suffrage was basically a few years later, 1887. It was denied. What we have there, what I have there on the side is that even though there was a split in the national organizations, there were still people, and this was a petition by the Douglas family, Frederick Douglass family, supporting a resolution to give women the right to vote. The other thing I always like to point out is that the 19th Amendment wording remained the same for 42 years. It never changed. It was this wording. And what you'll hear, and there are actually some attempts to change the wording to get it passed at the end by Southern senators who said, if we put white in this, we'll pass it. And the suffrage leaders, who were mainly white women, said no. So that it remained the same until it was passed 42 years later. Okay, back in Nebraska. Yes, Hebron, the hotbed of women's suffrage in the state of Nebraska. There was a couple, Erasmus Carell and his wife, Lucy. They were the co-editors of the pro-suffrage Hebron Journal. It was a very pro-suffrage newspaper, writing about suffrage all the time. Erasmus ran for the state legislature, and he introduced a bill in 1881 to remove male from the state constitution, which would give women the right to vote. This was our third try to get women's suffrage in the state of Nebraska. And so, you know, actually, not all states have the petition and referendum process that we have in Nebraska, where we get to vote, where we get to gather signatures and then vote on it if we don't like the way the legislature has acted. And so they actually did this. So they gathered enough signatures, and they basically had a campaign for the 1882 election to remove, not to approve this change to the state constitution. But still, the National Women's Suffrage Association, American Women's Suffrage Association, they both held their national conventions in Omaha, and so trying to get all this support for these amendments. But again, the male voters did reject the suffrage amendment, so our third chance was not successful. Also, another place where there was a very active women's suffrage movement in Nebraska was Beatrice. So this is Clara Bewick Colby, and she started publishing the Women's Tribune in 1883. And this became a national publication, and it was actually published into the 1920s. And so it was a national publication. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the suffrage movement was really kind of happening in the western United States and not so much in the east. And so this was a national publication which told stories about western states granting women the right to vote. And she later became president of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association, which then in 1919 became the League of Women Voters. And so those suffrage associations came over to the League. Another, I think, interesting story is Jessie Hale Moss. She was a young social worker from Chicago. She moved to Omaha, and at the time, the Young Women's Christian Association did not allow black women in its association. So she helped found the Negro Women's Christian Association. They also were pro-voting rights, but they also worked on community building and other issues. Okay, back to the national movement. After many, many years of not getting one state or territory to approve voting rights for women, they decided this isn't working, these two separate organizations aren't working, so we're going to join together. So the two organizations became the National American Woman Suffrage Association. The first president was Susan B. Anthony. Carrie Chapman Catt, pictured there, was the second president, and they started having some success. So, for example, 1890, Wyoming became the first state to grant women suffrage. Now, they had granted suffrage as a territory, and so when they were wanting to be admitted to the Union, Congress told them, you can be admitted, but women can't vote. And they said, nope, our women are going to vote. We're not going to abandon our women. So they were admitted into the United States, already having territorial suffrage. Colorado is an interesting story. Carrie Chapman Catt led that campaign in her early 30s. That was the first state where actually the men in the state voted for women to have suffrage. And those other states, you see, they're all Western. Utah came in the same way as Wyoming. They had granted their women the right to vote as a territory. Then Idaho and Washington, both men voted in the state to grant women. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Carrie Chapman Catt. She was born in 1859 in Wisconsin, but she moved to Iowa as a very young girl. She was raised in Charles City. She graduated in 1887 as the only woman in her class from what is now called Iowa State University, hence the fact that Iowa State dedicated this center to her. She became involved at the age of 28 in the Iowa Suffrage Association, and then in 1890 was elected as a delegate to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, led the Colorado campaign, and again in 1900, so she was very young in 1900, became the national president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and served till 1905. To kind of talk next about some of the other elements of the Suffrage Association. So here are two African American women who are very active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The association on a national level was open to women, or to black women. On some states and local levels, they did not admit black women. And that was mainly in the South. And so at the national level, they were open, and in most states they were open, but there were a few states in the South that did not allow African American women, but that was not the policy of the National Association. So Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett, both active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, but they established, kind of like Jessie Hale Moss did in Omaha, a separate association, but this time nationally, for the National Association of Colored Women. So again, this was also a pro-voting organization, but it also talked about educational achievements of African American women, other barriers that African American women had, so they also founded that. Mary Church Terrell gave kind of a famous speech in 1898 at the National American Women's Suffrage Association called The Progress of Colored Women, and it really talks about the insurmountable obstacles she faced because of racism and sexism. But she also introduced in that speech the lifting as we climb, which is still the motto of the National Association of Colored Women, and it really were a lot of educated women that thought that they had the responsibility to help women less fortunate than them. Ida B. Wells Barnett, she came out of the anti-lynching movement, and again, not only helped found the National Association of Colored Women, but also the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, which again was another organization dedicated to voting rights. Okay. So we also have a younger group of women. By this time, the movement is getting older getting not as successful. So militant women were joining the suffrage movement. Probably the best known are Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Alice Paul is pictured here. She and Lucy were educated, they got their graduate degrees in Great Britain. And in Great Britain, there was also a suffrage movement going on, and it was much more militant than it was in the United States. So they did protests, they did parades, which were apparently seen as militant back then, so they did that. They also lit things on fire, threw bombs. And so Lucy and Alice Paul were in that movement and then moved back to the United States. And they joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So the first, and Anna Howard Shaw was president at the time, not Carrie Chapman Catt, but Carrie was off in Europe. But they joined the association, and Anna Howard Shaw was the president, and they wanted to have a parade. So they approved a parade. So they had a very successful parade. It was in 1913. It was right before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated, and he was, at the time, he was not pro-women voting rights. They estimated they had 5,000 to 8,000 people walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. Inez Mulholland, that you'll see in the stuff, she rode a horse, and so it was a big event. They had African Americans marching in the parade, including Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell. They had members from Howard University, a traditional black university. They had Delta Sigma Theta, again, an African American women's sorority. And so it really was kind of a big thing. They also had, someone involved was was Doris Stevens. And I have some books up here you can look at afterwards. Doris Stevens Doris Stevens was born in Omaha, Nebraska. She was educated at Oberlin College, in Ohio, one of the few colleges at the time that admitted women. And then she moved to Washington, D.C. and became involved with Alice Paul's organization. Alice, after she did the parade, which was greatly successful, she thought the National American Women's Suffrage Association was not militant enough for her taste. So she formed, with Lucy Burns, the National Women's Party. And Doris Stevens was really mostly active in the National Women's Party. If you go to Suffs, you'll see Doris Stevens, in addition to Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul being central characters in Suffs, Doris Stevens is also portrayed in Suffs, and so you'll get to see a little bit about her. But she, when she wrote the book, it was really to document the strategies that the movement used. They used hunger strikes, they used protests. She was a group of the Silent Sentinels, and those are some of the signs that you see of women standing out in front of the White House to protest Woodrow Wilson and World War I. And so she was part of that. They were jailed, so hence her title of the book is Jailed for Freedom. And the book was republished in 2020 with the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Okay, so we passed up our chance to be the first territory and first state, but we kept trying. So in 1913, a suffrage bill failed by one vote in the legislature. And there were parades in the state, the first one being in Blair, Nebraska. Here's a picture from that. And so again, Nebraskans used a petition to put this on the ballot. So they're going to vote on it in 1914. So they collect enough signatures, and this had to be, by the way, male voters saying that they wanted to vote on it. So they collected it. It was opposed by the Nebraska Association, opposed to women's suffrage, and also the Catholic Church. And it was defeated by about 6 percentage points. And so again, we rejected suffrage. Had we passed it around that time, we would have been like the 10th or 11th or 12th state to approve women's suffrage, along with Montana and Nevada. Okay, so back to the national movement. Okay, the national movement is now at 67 years. They have speeches that are talking about that we're at a crossroads. We've got to do something now. So I mentioned earlier, Carrie Chapman Catt was in Europe. She also was working on international women's suffrage. She was really known throughout her years in the suffrage movement as a very good speaker and also as a great strategist. And so they asked her to come back from Europe. She did. She began her second term as president of the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1915. But when she came back, they were still kind of split in the movement by people who wanted a federal amendment and people who wanted state by state. She wanted a federal amendment. And so what she said is, okay, I'm going to come back, but I'm going to have my plan. So she had what she called a winning plan. and she called it a winning plan. And it was actually focused on a national constitutional amendment, a federal amendment. But then she said, and this is what I think the brilliant strategy was, and I think it failed with the Equal Rights Amendment, she knew that the states were going to have to ratify this thing, to put it in the Constitution. So she also directed money and attention, especially to states that had some form of suffrage, and that would include like Nebraska. So we had school suffrage at the time. And the other states had full suffrage. I think 15 states did. Some states had what they called presidential elector suffrage, which let you vote basically for president. And so let's work in those states that have some suffrage, and then we're going to ignore states like the ones in the South. We're not going to spend any money down there if we can't get what we want. So she had that. So the other thing she realized is that there was no state east of the Mississippi River that had women's suffrage. And so a lot of politicians said, this is stuff what they're doing out in the West. They're doing it out west, but they're not doing it in the populous states. They were in California by that time. So she was living in New York City. So she organized a campaign in 1915, failed. 1917, and here's a march in New York. So New York approved women's suffrage in 1917. That got the attention of Woodrow Wilson. Suddenly he's kind of like, maybe, and because at the time New York had 43 electoral votes. And so it was a very strategic move. So what she did is that once she led this campaign, Woodrow Wilson then became on board. Other U.S. senators became on board. She then proposed establishing the League of Women Voters in 1919 in a speech to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she actually established the League on February 14, 1920 at their national convention, 6 months before the amendment was passed. So again, this is that strategic part of it, that if this amendment is passed, then we have the ratification process, and then we have to educate and motivate women to vote. So we're going to come back to Nebraska. So now Nebraska's thinking, well, maybe we'll have one of these limited suffrage amendments that so many other states have. So it's 1917, and there was a limited suffrage bill that passed the legislature that year. That would grant, they already had school suffrage, but then they would have suffrage in municipal city elections. They could vote then, and then they also could vote for presidential electors. And when you're voting for president, even today, that's really what you're doing, when you say you're voting for presidential electors. And so they decided they'd have that. Now, they wouldn't get to vote for state-level offices, but they'd get to vote for more offices. It was signed into law by Governor Keith Neville on April 17, 1917. Point of personal pride here, that is my husband's grandfather. So Keith Neville, my husband's name was Keith Neville Bystrom, the first boy born in his family in years. Governor Neville had 4 daughters. His mother is the youngest and was born in the governor's mansion. But he was a pro-suffrage person, so he's pro-suffrage in his campaign. He also was against World War I, so he didn't get reelected because of that. But anyway, I was telling Emma before this, when I came to the suffrage exhibit here, it was before COVID, and we were walking through, and this photo of my husband's grandfather was part of the exhibit, so that's pretty cool. So, but like we can do in Nebraska, there were people that didn't want to grant this suffrage. So then there's another petition to basically vote this down. So we still have women coming to the forefront. So this article has this, I actually got this from your archives, by the way, the National Nebraska History Museum. So there was an anti-suffrage petition to basically then bring to the ballot to take away the right for women to vote in municipal and presidential electors. So we have 2 suffrage leaders from Omaha. And in this picture, and they only have their husbands' names underneath. That's what happened back then. But Catherine Subney is on the left, and then Grace Richardson of Omaha is on the right. And so they basically took all these signatures, and you hear about this even now, people poring over the signatures to get some disqualified. But Catherine and Grace found many fraudulent signatures on the petition, people that actually didn't exist. And so they the Secretary of State threw out the petition. It went to a court case, but they lost that too. So it never got voted on because it was fraudulent. So Nebraska women could then vote in local elections in 1919. They outvoted men in several places. This is just one example from Geneva, where more women voted than men on a sewage bond issue. I included this here because, I didn't even really know this at the time. I just found this out preparing for this. But at the time, Nebraska required all voters to disclose their weight, height, and age. Now, this was something that came up around the same time because the people against suffrage for women thought that women would not want to disclose this, particularly their weight and age. And so this article has this quote. So the woman in the middle is Mrs. Draper Smith, and I don't know her first name because I only have this cut line. So she was asked how old she was, and the article quotes her saying, "I am not ashamed to tell you I'm 63, although many take me to be 20 years more than my real age. Why not just put me down as short, stout, and gray?" I thought that was a great quote. So back to the national movement. So because of everything happening nationally, and I think Carrie Chapman Catt being very strategic, you get New York and then other states were coming in to grant their women's suffrage. So the House of Representatives approved women's suffrage in 1919 by a really pretty big vote. It was approved by the Senate also in 1919 on June 4th. And then what you see here is a lot of states jumping in right away to ratify this. Now, 3/4 of legislatures have to ratify a constitutional amendment before it becomes part of the U.S. Constitution. There were 48 states at the time, so that means that they had to get 36 states. So these are the states that ratified in 1919. Nebraska was the 14th, so they were pretty early on in that. So then you have 1920. And, still, I think what you see there is a representation of some southern states like Kentucky. You have, of course, the western states. Interestingly enough, Wyoming kind of, after all of their history on this, kind of came in a little bit later. But you have Arizona, New Mexico, Washington. But then you have also some Midwestern states like Indiana, Oklahoma, which would be more southwest, West Virginia, which would be more southern. And so you have them ratifying. But then that's 35 states, and they needed one more state. And there weren't a lot of choices. And so there were some states that the legislatures didn't meet every year, so they weren't even meeting in 1920. There were others that said, we're not going to vote on this. So it was really pretty slim pickings. So Carrie Chapman Catt chose Tennessee. Tennessee, southern state. Usually southern states were not very pro-suffrage. But Tennessee was a little different in that they had a very strong suffrage association there with both African American and white women involved and also men. They had a strong anti-suffrage movement. What you see here is an ad that was taken out in the Chattanooga and Nashville newspapers against Carrie Chapman Catt because she had written an article saying that all people, regardless of race, religion, et cetera, should have the right to vote. Apparently, they thought that was pretty controversial, so they ran these anti-suffrage ads in the local papers. So the House was really pretty pro-suffrage, so they passed it by a pretty large margin. The Senate. The House was divided. So also at the time, many years prior to this, the yellow rose became the symbol of the suffrage movement. I really don't know why. People ask me. I have a yellow rose dress, but sleeveless, so I didn't wear it today. But it became the emblem of the suffrage movement. So here, the senators and the legislators who supported suffrage wore a yellow rose, and those that did not wore a red rose. And so, in addition to their surveillance, Carrie Chapman Catt and her team were in Nashville at the Hermitage Hotel, holed up there. So they were, of course, doing all these, trying to figure out if it was going to pass in the House. If the House was deadlocked, which the rose count was showing, it would not pass because the Speaker of the House was against suffrage and he would vote against it. And so what ended up happening is that you have this Harry Byrne. So Harry Byrne is pictured there. He was 24 years old, youngest member of the legislature. He was from Eastern Tennessee. He actually was pro-suffrage, but his party told him that his constituents didn't like it. They fed him, what history books will tell you, some false information. They said, you'll never be elected again. So he was going around with his red rose, I guess, but his mom, there was not TV back then, so probably missed that. So his mother, Feb, was pro-suffrage. So she gives a telegram. So on the morning of the vote, Harry gets a telegram from his mother. Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speakers against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but I have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and to help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. He was really pretty early on. His name, it was alphabetical. He voted yes for women's suffrage. Tennessee went on to become the 36th state to ratify the suffrage amendment. And what I always like to tell people, two things by how this happened. People always telling me, my vote doesn't matter. My vote doesn't matter. So many things passed by one vote. This passed by one vote. Just in the last couple of years since I've been in Nebraska, school bond elections have passed by one vote. So it's really the power of the vote. And don't think your vote doesn't matter. Number two, the power of mothers. Okay, so the 19th Amendment, it went from Tennessee, it went to the Secretary of State, so it was certified on August 26th, 1920, which is still celebrated as Women's Equality Day. That's Carrie Chapman Catt, now in her 60s, but still stylish. She was a very stylish person wearing her hat. She gave a speech in New York City, a great speech actually on the day that it was ratified by the Secretary of State. She actually met with the Secretary of State, but they didn't want to do a celebration, so it was kind of this, they didn't make it a big thing at the White House, but she got to go. But anyway, she gave a speech, and it's not a long speech, but I like to quote this part of it, that the vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. And what I like here is it was a 72-year movement. So all the people that started at the beginning of the movement were dead. Carrie Chapman Catt, kind of goes on as being probably the longest leader in the movement because she started so early and actually lived at a long point of time for women in that century. But women have suffered agony of soul, which you can never comprehend. So telling people of all these suffrage leaders that have fought so long for this, so that you and your daughter, so again, looking to the future, might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Women died in the movement, not just from natural causes. Prize it. And then she ends with, again, always forward thinking, progress is calling on you to make no pause, act. And so it was there that actually I adopted that as like the motto of the Catt Center when I went there, because it really is about how you've got this right, now do something about it. Educate yourself, become involved, and vote. 27 million women were enfranchised in 1920, just right before the election, the presidential election that year. Sometimes you hear that black women couldn't vote. Black women could vote. It gave voting rights to any women citizens, which at that time were black and white women. There were some women that were not considered U.S. citizens, including Native Americans, including people of Asian descent, people of Spanish, of Mexican Hispanic descent. But black women could vote in 34 states. It was the same votes that black men could vote in. And also where they couldn't vote was usually in states in the Southeast, about 14 of them, where African American men had been disenfranchised since the 15th Amendment by poll taxes, literacy tests, and just outright violence. And so that's what happened. And some indigenous women could vote in 1920. It really kind of depended on your tribal agreement with the U.S. government. So, to conclude, before questions, and how are we doing on time? Okay, good. 5 minutes, okay. 5 minutes for the slide. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about how women voted. So back in 1920, when women could vote, we didn't have the Census Bureau tracking this. But the New York Times tried to do a survey, surveyed some parts of the country. They concluded that they thought about 46% of women voted and 75% of men. That's really high for male voters because now it doesn't go up for anybody as high as 75%. But I still think that was a pretty good turnout. The suffrage leaders, a lot of them, interviewed Mrs. Catt and said, "Oh, aren't you disappointed?" And she said, "Well, no. I mean, we just got the right, and so she wasn't disappointed." So I think some key points here is that by 1964 was the first time in history that more women than men voted by numbers. 1964. That has continued through every election, more women than men. Now, what you might argue is that women comprise slightly more of the U.S. population than men. It used to be about 51%. It's now a little bit below 51, but certainly a little bit more than men. So since 1980, the percentage of women voting has outpaced the percentage of men voting. That year is just 0.4%. That's also the year that the gender gap was discovered, and actually by Ronald Reagan's team, and they pointed out that women and men voted differently. And every election, women tend to vote for the Democratic candidate and men tend to vote for the Republican candidate. Now, the gender gap is very nuanced. You're going to hear all the time that white women, particularly in recent elections, have voted for the Republican candidate. African American women are overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate. But if you do women against men, and the other thing about the gender gap, you're going to read all the time misrepresentations by the media where they're really reporting how women vote for one candidate or the other candidate. That's called the women's vote. It's not the gender gap. The gender gap is really easy to remember, as I told my students. It's the gap between the two genders. So that's what the gender gap is. So the gender gap, since Ronald Reagan's team discovered it in 1980, that's been 12 elections. There has been a gender gap in every election since then. It has ranged from 4 points to 15 points. It was a 15-point gender gap in 2020 with Biden and Trump on the ticket. It has been over 10 points, double digits, 7 of those times in every election since 2012. So the gender gap has remained consistent 2012, 2016, 2020, and 2024. So these are just some, and I think we're good on time here. So I just put these dates up just in case. Drop boxes, you have drop boxes in Lincoln and Lancaster County, you have them in Omaha, but these are some deadlines. They're from the Secretary of State's office. He's got an interesting calendar, but it's really kind of takes you a long time to go through everything on the Secretary of State's page, so I took out a couple ones. Drop boxes, if you're using them in your county, they have to be opened up on April 3rd, and they have to be available until the election on May 12th, and that's our next election here. It's our primary election. First day of early voting is April 13th. A lot more people in Nebraska are doing early voting. It kind of started during COVID when people were afraid about being around a lot of people, but you can early vote starting at April 13th. It's usually at your county election office. On April 27th, if you're voting by mail, which also we can do here. I think in Nebraska it's called early absentee voting. You had to apply for it, and then they send you a ballot, but you should have it postmarked by April 27th. That's also the last day that you can register online to vote by 11:59, right before midnight. It's really easy to register online in Nebraska. And then on May 11th is the last day you can do early voting. May 12th is the primary. Office is open from 8 to 8 in our time zone. The general election's November 3rd. And then I also just want to point out a little thing about the League of Women Voters. We offer an online platform. We're currently contacting candidates right now. We don't ask any gotcha questions. You're going to see a lot of the organizations that say they're nonpartisan, and then they ask really kind of cultural type issues. Ours are not based on that. We're in the process now of collecting. So we basically, if you Google Vote 411 and put in Nebraska, you'll get your Nebraska ballot. We haven't launched it yet. We'll be launching it pretty soon, but it asks the candidates to give a bio, which we don't edit, so it's their bio. And then I think we usually ask them about 3 questions. And right now we're collecting information for candidates running for Congress. So that would be the 3 congressional districts and the 1 Senate race this year. U.S. Senate race, and then we're doing statewide races, which would be governor, secretary of state, attorney general, those races, and then we're also doing all legislative races, and the legislative races that are open this year are in even-numbered districts. So part of you in Lincoln actually got gerrymandered in my district in Cass County, and so some of you, if you live in a part of Lincoln, I know Jill does, are actually in District 2 with the rest of us in rural Nebraska. So anyway, 3 pieces of Lincoln got gerrymandered into other districts. You should have gotten your own district, but you didn't. So anyway, that is my remarks, and I'm happy now to take questions.
I was just wondering, I go to a lot of naturalization ceremonies, and before COVID, there was always the women there to help people to sign up after they became a new citizen. I have not seen those people there at those. Are they?
There was I have to remember the right one. So yes, I do still, so I'm on the communication team. Our director resigned, so now I'm actually doing that for the next couple of months, but I always was doing their social media. So it turned out to be a very technical thing. So there was an order by a department, I believe, either in the U.S. Justice Department, but they did say you couldn't register people to vote at naturalization ceremonies. So that was an executive order, not quite a year ago. So we were concerned about that, but then we consulted with attorneys, and the way we were doing it in Nebraska is that we were going to hearings that were judicial hearings, and they weren't covered in the law. So I know they're doing them in Omaha. You know, the only places that we were doing a lot of them were Omaha and Lincoln. So I know in Omaha, which is my local league, they started doing them again. So again, we consulted with an attorney. They said this directive doesn't apply to you, and so we were still doing naturalization ceremonies. So I'd have to check with the league here, but you said you haven't noticed any. So
I attend the ones in Beatrice as well, and I don't see anybody down in that area either.
it really depends on how the locality is conducting the registration. So there's some that are, like Omaha is exempt because it's conducted by a judicial court, and it's exempt from the law. And there's some in Nebraska which are not. They're covered by this. But it was a directive. I want to say it was Homeland Security, but it might have been civil rights decision. I'd have to look that up. But and we did a lot of social media about it at the time. But it was a directive from the federal government, an agency, that said that you could not register people to vote at naturalization ceremonies. You know, obviously targeted at a certain population. Yeah.
Is it possible to hand out flyers to those new citizens to let them know the best way for them to sign up to register to vote?
They're doing that in Omaha.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll do a little bit more research on it and tell Emma. And then if you want to give your name to Emma afterwards, I'll see what I can find out for you.
That'd be
Okay.
great.
Yeah. But again, Omaha, you know, they just, I mean, they never even canceled any. You know, once we got a ruling from an attorney really pretty quickly, and they said what we could do. And now I'm thinking about it. I think Lincoln wasn't doing it that way, so I think that was one thing that affected them here. So it depended on how you were going, how the naturalization ceremony was organized. Yes. Yeah.
You mentioned men who helped in the early suffrage years, and since we're in Lincoln, Nebraska, I'll ask whether William Jennings Bryan, because he was very much a political figure and was Secretary of State of the United States right before the one who signed the thing.
Yes, he was pro-suffrage, and probably another man I probably should put in my presentation. So in 1919, when I moved back to Nebraska and I became co-president of the League of Women Voters, and we were in Nebraska State League, and we were anticipating this huge celebration in 2020, we commissioned a suffrage exhibit. And why I know William Jennings Bryan is involved, because he has his own plaque. So yes, he was pro-suffrage, and so he is probably the only man who was featured in our exhibit. I think we have 6 different panels. They're freestanding. We had them at the state capitol for a while. We've also taken them we still have them. Sometimes I use them in my presentations. It's a lot to haul. But yes, William Jennings Bryan was pro-suffrage. Oops. Where's the microphone?
I have it.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're fine. So my understanding is that recently there has been some changes to the Postal Service definition of postmark. How has that affected voting and absentee ballots and mail-in voting?
I would say if you're going to vote for mail, get your mail-in ballot in as soon as possible. The Secretary of State is recommending a postmark deadline of April 27th. So he's still adhering. I mean, that is a postmark deadline, but what your question raises is that you can bring your letter on April 25th, and it still may not be, I mean, let's say you bring it in on the 20th. I wouldn't bring it in on the 27th because you don't have any guarantee right now. Postal offices no longer, it used to be the day you brought in your letter, it was postmarked. Now it's not required anymore. And I think in most cases it's not that the people are trying, I mean, it's a change in the rule with the U.S. Postal Service, the people in Washington, D.C. I don't think people are running around in your local post office holding mail, but I think what happens is it's just an acknowledgement of time. And so if I were you and if you're going to vote by mail, I would do one of 2 things. Put your turn it in way before April 27th. You have to have an April 27th postmark. And I don't think that's guaranteed if you bring it in on April 27th. I mean, you can bring it in and ask. The other thing I would say is that these drop boxes are totally secure. And I would and you can put your vote by mail ballot in a post office. And I know it's this way in Douglas County, and I think it's the same way in Lancaster County, is that their election boards have kept a lot of drop boxes all over the county. There are two of the counties that have. In my county, and I think it was kind of always this way, there's just one that I know of, and it's at the election office in Plattsmouth. And so you need to know where they are. But they've always had a lot of drop boxes in Omaha and Lincoln, and I think they still do. So I certainly wouldn't turn it in the day that the postmark is due, because I think that's pretty, you may not get it postmarked that date.
So has the League of Women Voters taken a stand on any possibility of resurrecting the ERA amendment?
Well, the League of Women Voters has supported the Equal Rights Amendment since its inception. It was voted on twice. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can only vote on something twice, but apparently that's been used against it. It would take, so the League of Women Voters is pro the Equal Rights Amendment since it was first initiated. My actually first really political campaign was in Oklahoma in 1979-80, because once they opened up voting again, Oklahoma was actually targeted as a state that might be a state that would ratify the ERA. They did not do it. It was thought that we were a state to spend some time in. But so really what has happened since, so a lot of things have happened. There are some states that came in right away, and and I can't even remember when this all started, but I think in the 70s. But there were some states that came in right away, including Nebraska. They were like the fourth state to ratify it. And then they took their ratification away. Like, oh, sorry, we're not going to ratify it. But is that even legally possible? So if these states, there's several states that said, oh, that was a mistake, I'm not ratifying it. Then on the other side of the spectrum, there have been states that have come in and ratified the amendment after the last attempt. And so now there's actually enough states that have ratified the ERA, but it's not going to get out of Congress, let alone go to the president for signature without some changing in the representation of this amendment and who's for it and who's against it. And then there'd be legal challenges. So there would, on the one hand, be legal challenges that states like Nebraska that tried to rescind their approval can't rescind it legally. And then the other side of it is that states that came in after the last attempt nationally can't do it now. But there was actually a resolution before the U.S. Senate in several years to try to get the ERA out of Congress, and they failed. The last one was while Biden was president, but it didn't get out of the Senate because there wasn't enough votes. So that's where we are. So yes, it could be resurrected again under a different political climate, but then there would be legal challenges on both sides.
In regards to the SAVE Act,
Oh, good. I did a lot of reading on that today. I just told me, okay, look at this.
so as a married woman, yeah, do we have to re-register to vote?
No, it's my understanding there's been two SAVE Acts passed by Congress this session. The latest one was just, in February 11, 2026. The vote in the House was 218 to 213, really close. I heard this morning that they're going to open debate on the SAVE Act in the Senate. There you need a supermajority, and so people don't think that they're going to change that. But it's my understanding, so the SAVE Act was actually first passed by the House in April, that version, and they sent it to the Senate. And then they passed a year ago, then they passed a new version in February of 2026. And that one is more restrictive. So it's my understanding, so they added a lot of stuff to this new SAVE Act. And what I'll tell you, there's a very good article that I would recommend. It's by the Associated Press. I saw it online on Sunday. If you go to the League of Women Voters Facebook page that you can just search for and go down a couple of posts, you'll see a link to the article. And it really summarizes what the current SAVE Act would do. It's still my understanding, now this doesn't really address that question, but it's my understanding that if you're currently registered to vote, you don't need to do anything. Now it does other things, that it does, that affects everybody. But on the voter registration, it does not require right now proof of citizenship. So that's the big thing. So if you're currently registered to vote, but I will tell you, if you move from the precinct you're in now to a new precinct, let's say I'm going to go move to the lake out by Lincoln. I'd love to live there. It's a different precinct. So you have to re-register to vote every time you move. So at that point in time, you then would need to prove your citizenship. And so there's all sorts of ways you can prove it. I see things on the internet that make me crazy. Like there was a guy the other day who was telling Emma, oh, don't worry about it because Real ID, driver's license, take care of that. There are 5 states that put your citizenship on your Real ID. Nebraska isn't one of them. So only 5 states do that. Military ID, you can use that, but you have to produce your papers for your record of service, and the current discharge papers don't include your citizenship. Another way to prove your citizenship is a passport, but those cost like $165, $130 on renewal, which some people consider a poll tax, which is actually outlawed by the Constitution Amendment 24. Tribal, you can accept those, but with tribal, they have to have also some kind of proof of citizenship on it, with a lot of tribal don't. Student IDs won't count under the SAVE Act. You can't use your student ID. And so it's really much more restrictive. But if you think you're going to live in your same district for the rest of your life and never move, the SAVE Act wouldn't affect right now. But for most Americans, and then the other thing that comes up on the other side of it, which I've already experienced, is that if you changed your name upon marriage and you have to re-register, then you have to somehow produce either a passport or a birth certificate, in some cases a marriage license. They all cost money and they're difficult to get. Some places that kept your marriage license or your birth certificate have burned down and you can't get it. It doesn't, a lot of us as parents, we get this little thing from the hospital. That doesn't count. So anyway.
Because it has to be a legal.
It has to be a legal document.
Official stamp.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it can't be a copy of it. It has to be the original, which those cost anywhere from $20 to $100 to get, and time. I mean, that's the other thing. If it passes, there's really not a lot of time to get this all. And then I guess I would say the last thing that's pointed out in this article is that the SAVE Act does not include any money for states to implement it. So.
There'll be a run after the
Yeah.
office of records.
Yeah. So.
Getting married, we're divorced.
Yes, it's married and divorced, it's all sorts of things. I mean, I tell a story, and I don't know if I found out later this was probably illegal, but so when I went from voting in Iowa to Nebraska in Cass County, my husband and I both, when we moved here, like August, and there was an election in 2018. So my husband, we get all our stuff. So we have our passports, driver's license, and birth certificates. We thought, that'll be plenty. I mean, I looked at the Secretary of State's website. It's like, I'll bring all this stuff. So we both had the same documents. So he gets his driver's license, which again, it was really kind of effective on the driver's license. So he gets his driver's license, but I was told I couldn't have my driver's license until I produced my marriage certificate. Now, my maiden name, as I told my maiden name is Gabrikiewicz. It's on my passport and my driver's license. Who's going to use that as like your maiden name? And it's on my birth certificate. And they insisted that I couldn't have a driver's license or my voter card until I produced a marriage license. So we just moved. We couldn't find it. I had to write off for it. It took about 2 months. And I thought I wasn't going to be able to vote in the election, but I got it. So again, that was a personal experience of mine. Another thing that you see, so the SAVE Act, the messaging on it, a lot of the messaging that you'll see is that it's about voter ID. And then so they'll say 85% of Americans approve of the SAVE Act. 85% of Americans approve voter ID. And we already have that in Nebraska. We have photo ID. Most states have gone to that. I heard on the news this morning when I was watching it by a Democratic senator who said, if they just wanted to put this was voter ID, it would pass. It would pass almost unanimously in the Senate. So it's not about voter ID, which is popular. And when you see the 85%, that's not about the SAVE Act. That's about voter ID, photo ID, which most states have now.
just going to thank her very much. Thank you, Dianne, for educating us very much here. I want to promote Suff. The Broadway show is coming to the league on May 5th, 3rd, 5th through
10th, I think it is. And I actually have that in my notes, so I forgot to mention it. So I think I did mention Suff, but the
Yeah.
principal characters in Suff are going to be Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, the National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And I think the thing that I thought was really cool about it, and I saw it on Broadway a couple of summers ago, and it also, Doris Stevens from Omaha is really in a primary role, which I was excited to see because, you don't really hear a lot about her. But again, and then I have some suffrage books up here. You're welcome to look at them. This is actually by the Nebraska History Museum, so I have that. I have several up here, and you can look at them and ask me any other questions that you have before you leave. But thank you for coming.
Yeah, please join me in thanking you.